The sleek silver educational vessel of the Galactic Academic Federation dropped out of hyperspace just beyond Earth's moon. Inside, 22 alien students pressed against the viewport windows, their varied anatomies, from insectoid to reptilian to gelatinous, creating a colorful mosaic against the glass. Professor Zix Tyrrell clicked his mandibles to gain attention. "Students, we are approaching the planet called Earth. Remember, this is the first official cultural exchange with humans focused on military history. Please maintain respectful behavior." The blue-green planet grew larger as they approached. Several students whispered among themselves about the primitive civilization they were about to study. Earth had only achieved faster-than-light travel 30 years ago, making them newcomers to the galactic community. "I heard they were still killing each other with metal projectiles just a century ago," whispered Vasnar, a tall, willowy being with translucent skin that revealed swirling purple organs beneath. "Barbaric," agreed Elliptra, whose crystalline body refracted light in rainbow patterns across the cabin floor. "My species hasn't engaged in physical conflict for 8,000 years. Professor Zixa Tyrrell overheard them. "That attitude is precisely why this exchange is valuable. Do not mistake different for inferior. Humans have fought more wars in their short history than most galactic species combined. There is much to learn from them, even if those lessons show us paths to avoid." The ship landed smoothly at the international spaceport in Geneva. As the boarding ramp extended, the alien students were greeted by a small welcoming committee of humans. A woman stepped forward. She wore a crisp blue uniform with various colored pins and medals across her chest. Her gray-streaked brown hair was pulled back tightly, and her posture was perfectly straight. "Welcome to Earth. I am Professor Carol Miller from the United States Military Academy at West Point. I'll be your guide for this educational exchange." Her voice was firm, but not unfriendly. "We have prepared comprehensive tours of our military, museums, memorials, and training facilities across the globe." Professor Zix Tyrrell extended 4 of his 6 limbs in greeting. "The Galactic Academic Federation thanks you for this opportunity. My students represent the top military history scholars from 20 different peaceful civilizations." The alien students shuffled nervously as they exited the ship. Most had never been in the presence of humans before. Humans were known throughout the galaxy for their unusual endurance, adaptability, and, most disturbingly, their propensity for warfare. After clearing customs and a brief rest at their accommodations, the group boarded ground transportation to their first destination, the National Museum of Military History in Washington, D.C. "Our tour begins with ancient warfare," Professor Miller explained as they entered a vast hall filled with primitive weapons behind protective fields. Humans fought with these tools for thousands of years before developing more advanced technology. The alien students moved slowly through displays of swords, shields, bows, and armor. They paused at a large diorama showing 2 ancient armies facing each other across a battlefield. "This represents the Battle of Cannae, fought in 216 BCE, Professor Miller said, activating a holographic simulation. Tiny figures moved across the diorama, showing how Hannibal's forces surrounded and destroyed a much larger Roman army. 80,000 human lives ended here in a single day," she continued matter-of-factly. A stunned silence fell over the alien students. Krell, a stocky reptilian student with iridescent scales, finally spoke. "Professor Miller, I don't understand. My species has never lost so many in our entire recorded history. Why would humans sacrifice themselves this way?" Professor Miller considered the question. "Resources, territory, ideology, power. The reasons varied throughout our history." "But couldn't you just negotiate?" asked Vasnar, genuinely confused. "Share resources? Compromise on territory?" A small smile crossed Professor Miller's face. "Sometimes we did, but often one or both sides believed they could win more through fighting than talking. Human history is largely the story of when to fight and when to talk, and learning the wisdom to know the difference." The tour continued to a section displaying medieval weapons and armor. Professor Miller demonstrated the weight of a knight's armor by putting on a gauntlet. "Humans wore metal weighing half their body weight into battle?" asked a gelatinous student. "Named Plex, its translucent body rippling with shock." "Yes. And they fought for hours wearing it, Professor Miller replied. As they moved through the exhibits, a security officer named Greg Harris joined their group. He was tall with broad shoulders and walked with the unmistakable gait of someone with military training. Officer Harris will be with us throughout the tour for security purposes, Professor Miller explained. Are we in danger? Asked Elliptra nervously. No, Officer Harris answered with a reassuring smile. Standard protocol for diplomatic visits. My presence is mostly ceremonial. The group reached an exhibit about naval warfare, showing wooden ships with rows of cannons. These vessels would approach each other and fire metal projectiles until one sank or surrendered, Professor Miller explained. The sailors knew when they boarded that many would not return. But why would they board at all? Asked another student. Professor Miller's eyes grew distant. Duty, honor, necessity. Sometimes protecting your people means risking everything. The aliens exchanged uncomfortable glances. Such concepts were foreign to species that had evolved beyond physical conflict. The final exhibit of the day showed the American Civil War. Professor Miller explained how the nation had literally split in two and fought against itself over fundamental differences in values. Brothers killed brothers, she said quietly. It nearly destroyed us as a nation. Over 600,000 died. And yet you display this tragedy openly, observed Professor Zix-Terrell. We remember so we don't repeat our mistakes, Officer Harris said unexpectedly. All eyes turned to him. My great-great-great-grandfather fought in that war. We preserve these memories not to glorify war, but to understand its cost. As the day ended, and the alien students prepared to return to their accommodations, Vasnar approached Professor Miller privately. Professor, today has been disturbing, the alien admitted. My species resolves all conflicts through logical consensus. We cannot comprehend choosing death over compromise. Professor Miller nodded. That's why these exchanges matter, Vasnar. Tomorrow might be even more difficult for you. We'll be examining the world wars, conflicts that engulfed our entire planet. That night, back at their quarters, the alien students gathered in their common area, discussing what they'd seen. They're savages, whispered one. No, countered Krell. They're survivors. There's a difference. Elliptra's crystalline form shimmered with emotion. How can any species endure such violence and not destroy itself completely? Professor Zix-Terrell, listening from the doorway, finally spoke. That, my students, is precisely why we are here. We must understand how humanity faced its darkest nature repeatedly, and somehow emerged not just intact but reaching for the stars. The students fell silent, contemplating tomorrow's lessons with a mixture of dread and growing reluctant respect for the strange, resilient species called humans. The morning sun cast long shadows across the World War Memorial as the alien students gathered outside. Many had slept poorly, their dreams filled with images of ancient battlefields from yesterday's tour. Today promised to be even more challenging. Today, we examine what we call world wars, conflicts that engulfed our entire planet, Professor Miller explained as they walked through the entrance. We'll focus on the Second World War, which occurred less than 200 years ago. The memorial building was massive with solemn architecture and large stone columns. Inside, the central hall opened to reveal a three-dimensional holographic map of Earth. With a gesture from Professor Miller, the map illuminated to show the countries involved in the conflict. Red represents Axis powers, blue represents Allied nations, she explained. At its peak, this war involved over 60 countries and resulted in approximately 75 million deaths. A horrified silence fell over the group. Vasnar's translucent skin turned ashen gray. Elliptra's crystalline form vibrated with distress, creating a high-pitched hum. 75 million? Krell finally asked, scales flaring. That's more than the total population of my entire home system. Professor Miller nodded solemnly. This wasn't our only global conflict, but it was our largest. It shaped human development for generations. The tour moved through rooms showing the progression. of the war. The aliens observed models of tanks, aircraft, ships, and weapons that seemed primitive but devastatingly effective. They paused at a display about the Battle of Stalingrad. The holographic presentation showed the brutal urban combat, soldiers fighting house to house in freezing conditions. The average life expectancy of a new soldier at Stalingrad was less than 24 hours, Professor Miller stated. Yet they kept fighting for 5 months. Elliptra suddenly swayed and collapsed, her crystalline form falling with a soft tinkling sound. The other students gasped and moved back. Officer Harris was at her side immediately, ensuring she hadn't cracked or shattered. "She's just fainted," he confirmed after checking her vital signs. Professor Zix Terrell moved forward, mandibles clicking with concern. "Perhaps we should proceed to a less intense exhibit while she recovers. I'll stay with her." Officer Harris volunteered as 2 museum staff members brought a special cushioned stretcher designed for non-human physiology. The rest of the group moved to a different section. This room was darkened, with video screens, showing footage of the D-Day landing at Normandy. The aliens watched in stunned silence as waves of human soldiers rushed from boats onto beaches under heavy fire. "Why would they exit in such an exposed formation?" asked a small insectoid student. "It defies tactical logic." They had few alternatives, Professor Miller answered. "Sometimes the only path forward is directly through the greatest danger." The videos showed men falling, yet others continuing forward. Some dragged wounded comrades to safety while under fire themselves. "These soldiers knew many would die," Professor Miller continued. "They went anyway." Krell stepped closer to one screen, watching intently. "In my culture, we have a concept called logical preservation. The group protects its strongest members at all costs for the future benefit of all. This," he gestured at the footage, "this contradicts everything we believe about survival. Humans often place mission above self," Professor Miller explained. "One person might sacrifice so many others can live." By now, Elliptra had recovered and rejoined the group with Officer Harris. Her crystalline form still showed stress fractures along her surface. "Are you well enough to continue?" Professor Zix Terrell asked her. "Yes," she responded quietly. "I must understand this, however disturbing." The next section focused on technological development during wartime. Professor Miller explained how radar, jet engines, rocketry, nuclear power, and even early computing had all advanced rapidly due to military needs. "Your species achieves technological progress through conflict?" asked Vasnar, clearly troubled. "Often, yes," Professor Miller admitted. "War drives innovation by creating urgent necessity. Many technologies you use in daily galactic life originated in human military research." The group moved to a somber room dedicated to the Holocaust and other genocides. Professor Miller spoke quietly about the darkest aspects of human nature, how war could enable atrocities and how hatred could be weaponized. "We show you this not with pride but as warning," she said. "Humans can descend to terrible depths. That's why remembering matters." The final exhibit of the day contained personal artifacts from soldiers, letters to loved ones, worn photographs, dog tags, and blood-stained uniforms. Each item here belonged to someone who didn't return home, Professor Miller explained. She stopped at a display containing a small pocket watch with a bullet hole through its center. This watch stopped a bullet that would have killed Private Samuel Adams. He carried it every day after, even long after the war ended. He donated it before his death 50 years later. Officer Harris stepped forward unexpectedly. "That was my great-grandfather," he said quietly. The alien students turned to him in surprise. He never spoke much about the war, but he made sure we understood its cost. As the day's tour concluded, the alien students gathered outside the memorial, mentally exhausted. The setting sun painted the sky in colors that reminded Vasnar of blood. "How do you bear it?" Vasnar asked Professor Miller. "Knowing your ancestors endured such horrors?" Professor Miller considered the question carefully. "We bear it by remembering, by honoring their sacrifice, and by working to ensure such total wars never happen again." That evening in their quarters, the alien students held an impromptu discussion. Professor Zix Terrell observed silently as his students processed what they had learned. Their history should have destroyed them, said one student. No species could survive such self-inflicted damage. Yet they did survive, Krell pointed out. And they didn't just survive. They evolved and grew stronger. Perhaps there is something to learn from humans after all, Vasnar added thoughtfully. Not about how to fight, but about resilience. Elliptra, still showing stress fractures from her earlier collapse, spoke last. Tomorrow we see modern warfare. I fear what we'll discover about these humans. Professor Zix Terrell finally joined the conversation. Whatever you learn tomorrow, remember this. Humanity's capacity for violence is matched by their capacity for compassion. They fought devastating wars, yes. But they also created art, music, literature, and eventually joined the galactic community peacefully. As the students retired for the night, Krell lingered by the window, watching Earth's moon rise. In just 2 days, his perception of humans had changed dramatically. He no longer saw them as primitive or barbaric. He saw them as dangerously complex, terrifyingly resilient, and worthy of both caution and respect. Tomorrow would bring new revelations about Earth's combat history. Krell wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew he would never see the galaxy the same way again. Dawn broke over a military training facility located in a desert region. The alien students exited their transport vehicle, immediately feeling the dry heat of the morning sun. Today's lesson would focus on modern warfare and combat ethics. Welcome to Fort Bravo, Professor Miller said. This is an active training ground where our soldiers learn modern combat techniques. The alien students noticed soldiers in the distance running obstacle courses and practicing with weapons. The sounds of controlled explosions and gunfire echoed across the landscape. Today you will observe how humans prepare for conflict in the current era, Professor Miller continued. You'll also learn about the rules we've developed to govern warfare. Vasnar tilted his head in confusion. Rules for warfare? That seems contradictory. Professor Miller smiled slightly. It might seem that way. Follow me. She led them to a classroom building where they sat around a large table. On the wall were digital displays showing various documents. These are what we call the Geneva Conventions and Rules of Engagement, Professor Miller explained. They represent humanity's attempt to maintain our moral principles even during our darkest hours. The alien students listened as Professor Miller explained concepts like treatment of prisoners, protection of civilians, and prohibited weapons. Their expressions showed increasing confusion. Your species created rules for how to kill each other? Vasnar finally asked, his translucent skin pulsing with bewilderment. We created rules to preserve our humanity even in our darkest moments, Professor Miller replied calmly. War brings out both the worst and best in humans. These rules help us remember who we are. Professor Zix Terrell clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. Fascinating. My research shows that most galactic species either evolved beyond violence entirely or destroyed themselves before reaching space. Humans found a middle path, accepting violence as part of your nature while creating boundaries around it. The class moved outside to an observation platform overlooking a training field. A group of human soldiers in combat gear assembled before them. A woman with short brown hair stepped forward. This is Sergeant Lisa Hughes, Professor Miller introduced. She'll demonstrate modern combat techniques with her squad. Sergeant Hughes nodded to the aliens. My team will show you standard urban combat procedures. We'll be using training weapons, with light and sound effects, but no actual projectiles. What followed amazed the alien students. Sergeant Hughes and her squad moved through a mock town setting, communicating with hand signals, protecting each other, and neutralizing simulated threats. What appeared chaotic to the aliens was actually a carefully coordinated dance of protection and precision. They move as one organism, whispered Elliptra, her crystalline form reflecting the sunlight. Note how they prioritize protecting civilians, Professor Miller pointed out as the squad carefully cleared a building containing volunteer actors playing non-combatants. After the demonstration, Sergeant Hughes approached the group, wiping sweat from her forehead. Any questions? She asked. Krell stepped forward. How long did it take to learn these movements? Years of training, Sergeant Hughes replied. And we never stopped learning. Every combat situation is unique. Are you not afraid? Asked another. Student Sergeant Hughes considered the question carefully. Of course we are. Fear keeps you sharp. The goal isn't to be fearless, it's to act effectively despite being afraid. After lunch, the aliens were led to a separate building containing rows of what looked like reclining chairs with helmet attachments. These are combat simulation units, explained Officer Harris. They provide virtual reality experiences of historical battles. Would any of you like to try? The alien students looked at each other nervously. Finally, Krell stepped forward. Volunteer, he said. Officer Harris helped Krell into one of the chairs and placed the helmet over his reptilian head. I've programmed a mild experience, a World War I trench scenario. It lasts 10 minutes but can be ended at any time by saying, "Terminate simulation." The other students watched Krell's body language as he entered the simulation. At first, he remained still. Then his breathing quickened. His scales began to shift colors from green to red, a sign of stress in his species. His clawed hands gripped the chair arms tightly. After only 4 minutes, Krell suddenly gasped. "Terminate simulation! Terminate simulation!" Officer Harris quickly removed the helmet. Krell sat up, trembling. His scales continued to pulse between colors. "Are you all right?" Professor Miller asked with concern. "No," Krell answered honestly. "I experienced only minutes of what your soldiers endured for years. The noise, the fear, the chaos." He paused, struggling to find words. "How did they maintain sanity?" "Many didn't," Professor Miller said softly. "We call it shell shock in that era, or PTSD today. The psychological impacts of war often last longer than physical wounds." The final activity of the day was a visit to a military hospital, where wounded veterans volunteered to speak with the alien students. The aliens met humans who had lost limbs, suffered burns, or experienced other injuries during recent conflicts. A soldier named Alex Rivera, who had prosthetic legs, spoke with Vasnar. "I don't regret my service," Rivera explained. "I knew the risks when I enlisted." "But why take such risks at all?" Vasnar asked. "To protect others who couldn't protect themselves," Rivera replied simply. "And to stand beside my fellow soldiers, who would do the same for me." As the day ended and the group prepared to leave, Professor Miller gathered them together. "Tomorrow will be our most challenging day," she warned. "We'll be discussing humanity's most destructive weapons in the Cold War, a time when we nearly destroyed ourselves completely." On the transport back to their quarters, the alien students were unusually quiet, each lost in thought. Even Professor Zixteril seemed subdued. Back at their temporary residence, Krell approached Officer Harris, who was checking security systems. "Officer Harris," Krell began hesitantly. "After experiencing even a simulation of battle, I must know. How do humans willingly enter such situations?" Officer Harris paused his work and turned to face Krell. "Different reasons for different people. Duty, protection of loved ones. Sometimes because there seems no other choice. And you? Why did you serve?" Officer Harris looked at the floor before answering. "My grandfather told me something before I enlisted. He said, 'Peace isn't the natural state of things, it's something that must be built and protected.' I believed that then. I still do." Krell nodded slowly, his scales finally settling back to their normal green hue. "I think I'm beginning to understand humans a little better now." That night, the alien students gathered again to discuss what they had learned. Their conversation was more subdued than previous evenings, weighted with new understanding. "I never imagined I would respect humans," Vasnar admitted. "But there is something admirable in their resilience, their ability to create rules even for war. Tomorrow we learn about weapons that could destroy entire planets," Ellipter reminded them nervously. "I wonder what that will teach us about human nature." "Perhaps," said Professor Zixteril from the doorway, "it will teach us the most important lesson of all." Dark clouds gathered overhead as the alien students entered the Aerospace Military Museum. The weather seemed fitting for what Professor Miller had described as their most difficult day yet. "Today we examine humanity's most destructive weapons and the Cold War period," Professor Miller explained as they walked through security. This is the era when humans gained the ability to destroy our entire planet. The main hall contained massive missiles behind protective barriers. The size alone made several of the alien students step back nervously. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, Professor Miller said. They could deliver nuclear warheads thousands of miles away in under 30 minutes. Vasnar's translucent skin paled. Nuclear warheads? You mentioned those briefly before. Professor Miller nodded gravely. Nuclear weapons release enormous energy by splitting or fusing atoms. A single bomb could destroy an entire city. She activated a holographic display showing the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended World War II. The aliens watched in horror as the mushroom clouds rose and cities were flattened in seconds. 2 bombs, Professor Miller continued quietly. 2 bombs killed over 200,000 people almost instantly, and these were small compared to what came later. Elliptra's crystalline form vibrated with distress. How could you create such things? The same way many technological advances happen, seeking an advantage over enemies, Professor Miller answered honestly. The scientists who developed the first bombs didn't fully understand their power. Afterward, many spent their lives advocating against nuclear weapons. The tour continued to an exhibit about the Cold War. Displays showed the massive buildup of nuclear arsenals by the United States and Soviet Union. At the peak, Earth had over 60,000 nuclear warheads, Professor Miller explained. Enough to destroy all life on our planet many times over. Krell's scales darkened with shock. But you didn't use them, despite having so many? No, Professor Miller said. This was a Cold War fought through proxies, espionage, and threats rather than direct conflict. Both sides realized that using nuclear weapons would mean mutual destruction. You developed weapons that could destroy your entire planet, and then chose not to use them, asked Elliptra, struggling to reconcile this restraint with humanity's otherwise violent history. Professor Miller pointed to a display showing the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Neither side could strike first without being destroyed in return. We lived under this balance of terror for decades. Officer Harris, who had been quiet most of the morning, spoke up. My parents grew up during this time. They did drills in school where they hid under desks in case of nuclear attack. Would desks have protected them? Asked a student. No, Officer Harris replied simply. But it gave the illusion of control in an uncontrollable situation. The group moved to another section showing various missile defense systems and early shear warning networks. We came within minutes of nuclear war several times, Professor Miller explained. Once because of a flock of geese that radar operators mistook for missiles. Another time because of a computer error. Each time, individual humans made decisions not to launch, even when their protocols said they should. The aliens listened intently as Professor Miller told the story of Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet officer who chose not to report what appeared to be an American missile launch, correctly suspecting it was a false alarm. One human's judgment saved your world? Professor Zixteril asked. More than once, Professor Miller confirmed. The fate of our planet often rested on split-second decisions by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. After lunch in the museum cafeteria, the group prepared to visit the final exhibit, a preserved nuclear missile silo that visitors could enter. As they gathered near the entrance, a commotion erupted at the far end of the hall. A small group of humans carrying signs pushed past security guards. Earth for humans only, one shouted. No alien influence. The protesters moved aggressively toward the alien students. Before security could reach them, Officer Harris and Professor Miller instantly moved to position themselves between the protesters and the alien students. Stay behind us, Officer Harris instructed calmly, his body tense but his voice steady. Professor Miller stood shoulder to shoulder with him. Museum security will handle this. Just stay together. The protesters came within a few meters before museum security and local police intercepted them. The confrontation was brief, with the protesters being escorted out while shouting angry slogans. When it was over, Vasnar looked at Professor Miller and Officer Harris with new understanding. You protected us, without hesitation. Of course. We did, Officer Harris replied simply. But why? Pressed Krell. We are not your species. Professor Miller straightened her uniform. You are our guests, and more importantly, you pose no threat. Protection of the innocent isn't limited by species. The remainder of the tour was completed without incident, though the alien students stayed closer together than before. By the time they returned to their quarters that evening, they were exhausted both physically and emotionally. In their common area, the students broke into heated debate. Humans are too dangerous, insisted one student, a floating gas-based being. They created weapons that could destroy their own planet. They should never have been allowed into the galactic community. But they showed restraint, countered Vasnar. They had the power to destroy themselves and didn't use it. That suggests wisdom alongside their capacity for violence. What about those protesters today? Asked another student. They showed that humans still harbor aggression toward other species. A small minority, Krell argued, while two humans immediately moved to protect us without concern for their own safety. Professor Zix Tyrrell observed the debate silently, mandibles clicking occasionally as different points were raised. Elliptra, who had been quiet, finally spoke. I have been analyzing human history as presented to us. I see a pattern. Humans develop terrifying capabilities for destruction, come to the edge of using them, then pull back and create systems to prevent their use. It's as if they must approach the abyss to recognize its danger. The debate continued late into the night with the class roughly split. Half believed humans were too dangerous to fully trust in galactic affairs. The other half argued that any species that could create such destruction but then develop the wisdom not to use it might be exactly what the peaceful, perhaps too complacent, galactic community needed. Professor Zix Tyrrell finally intervened when tempers began to rise. Tomorrow is our final day, he reminded them. We will meet with veterans from various human conflicts. Reserve your final judgments until you've heard their personal stories. As the students retired for the night, Krell found himself unable to sleep. He kept thinking of Officer Harris standing protectively in front of them, a human willing to face potential harm from his own kind to protect aliens he barely knew. Perhaps, Krell thought, humans were neither the savages nor the noble, warriors they had seemed at different points during this visit. Perhaps they were simply a species still finding their path, carrying both terrible destructive potential and remarkable capacity for protection and sacrifice, a complexity that the older, more peaceful galactic species had long ago forgotten or never possessed. Sunlight streamed through tall windows as the alien students entered the final venue of their educational tour, the United Nations Peace Hall. The Grand Chamber featured flags from all Earth nations, and more recently added, banners representing the various galactic civilizations that had established relations with humanity. Today we conclude our study of Earth's combat history, Professor Miller announced, but we end not with weapons or battles, but with people. You'll meet veterans who have experienced war firsthand. The aliens took seats in a semicircle. Before them sat 4 humans of various ages wearing different styles of formal military dress. Professor Miller introduced each one. Commander Jack Powell, retired naval officer with 30 years of service. An older man with white hair and weathered skin, nodded respectfully. Captain Susan Barnes, former infantry commander who served in 3 conflict zones. A middle-aged woman with short gray hair and steady eyes acknowledged them with a slight smile. Dr. Alan West, former combat medic who treated wounded on both sides of conflicts. A man with kind eyes and hands that showed slight tremors gave a warm nod. And Airman Olivia Martinez, who served in our most recent conflicts and now works in peace-building initiatives. A younger woman with a serious expression and a prosthetic right hand completed the panel. These veterans have volunteered to answer your questions honestly, Professor Miller explained. They represent different experiences of human warfare. At first, the alien students hesitated. Then Vasnar spoke up. Why did you choose military service knowing you might die? The 4 veterans exchanged glances before Commander Powell answered. Different reasons for each of us, I suspect. For me, it was family tradition. My father and grandfather served. But I stayed because I believed in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Captain Barnes added, I joined for educational opportunities. The military would pay for my schooling, but I remained for my fellow soldiers. The bonds formed in difficult situations become unbreakable. Elliptra's crystalline form shimmered as she asked, "Did you feel hatred toward your enemies?" Dr. West leaned forward. "Sometimes in the moment, yes. But treating wounded from both sides taught me something important. Beneath the uniforms, we're all the same. Pain, fear, hope for survival. These don't change based on which flag you serve." More questions followed. The alien students asked about fear, about killing, about loss. The veterans answered each question thoughtfully, neither glorifying war nor minimizing its realities. When Krell asked about nightmares, Airman Martinez spoke for the first time. "I still have them," she admitted. "Not about what happened to me." She lifted her prosthetic hand. "This I've made peace with. The nightmares are about those I couldn't save." Her honesty created a moment of profound silence in the room. After the panel, the group moved to a reception area where they could speak with individual veterans more informally. Krell approached Commander Powell. "After experiencing combat," Krell asked, "how do you feel about Earth joining the galactic community? Some believe your warlike tendencies make humans dangerous allies." The commander considered this carefully. "Perhaps they're right to be cautious. Humans can be dangerous, but I think our combat history gives us something valuable. We don't take peace for granted. We know its cost." Across the room, Elliptra spoke with Dr. West. "Did treating the wounded change your view of conflict?" "Completely," he replied. "In medical school, we learn that healing is the priority, not nationality, not ideology. When you're trying to save a life, nothing else matters. I wish more people could see others that way without needing the lesson of war." Meanwhile, Vasnar had engaged Captain Barnes in conversation about human resilience. "Your species endures hardships that would break most galactic civilizations," Vasnar observed. "How?" "We adapt," she answered simply. "And we find meaning in struggle. Sometimes the harder the path, the more we value reaching its end." As the morning progressed, Professor Zix Terrell observed his students with growing satisfaction. They were asking thoughtful questions, listening carefully to answers, and engaging in genuine dialogue instead of making judgments. Near midday, they gathered for the closing ceremony. Representatives from both Earth governments and the Galactic Academic Federation were present. Speeches were made about cultural exchange and mutual understanding. Then, unexpectedly, Student Krell approached the podium. He had requested permission to speak on behalf of the visiting class. "We came to Earth expecting to study a primitive, species barely worth galactic notice," Krell began, his scales shifting to a formal blue hue. "We leave humbled by your resilience." The room grew quiet as he continued. "Where our species knew peace because we never faced true threats, yours created peace, despite knowing war's full horror. You fight not because you love violence, but because you love what you're protecting more than you fear death. This is a concept many of us are still struggling to comprehend, but one we recognize may be essential for the galaxy's future." Krell looked directly at Officer Harris and Professor Miller as he concluded. "Thank you for showing us not just your weapons and battles, but your reasons, your rules, and your hearts. We have learned more than we expected, and we will carry these lessons back to our worlds." The ceremony concluded with formal exchanges of gifts and promises of continued cultural dialogue. As the alien students prepared to board their vessel for departure, Professor Miller approached Professor Zixateril. "Was the educational exchange what you hoped for?" she asked. The alien professor's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "Far more. I expected them to learn about human combat history. I did not expect them to learn about human nature." "And what did they learn about human nature?" she pressed. "That it contains multitudes," he replied. "Capacity for destruction alongside capacity for protection. Tendency toward conflict balanced by desire for peace. Your paradoxes make you interesting." Professor Miller smiled slightly. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the alien vessel lifted off from Earth, Krell looked out the viewport at the blue-green planet growing smaller below. He thought about everything they had learned, from ancient battles to world wars to nuclear standoffs. Professor Zix Terrell found him there and stood beside him in silence for a moment. "You've been unusually contemplative during this journey." "Krell," the professor observed. "I'm reconsidering my doctoral thesis," Krell admitted. "I had planned to write about primitive species' inefficient conflict resolution mechanisms. Now I'm considering something different." "Oh? Perhaps. Conflict as crucible, how Earth's combat history forged a resilient species." Professor Zix Terrell made a sound that might have been a chuckle. "An excellent topic." Back in his private quarters, Professor Zix's Terrell updated his course syllabus for the next semester. The new title read, "Human Combat Psychology: What the Galaxy's Peaceful Species Must Learn Before It's Too Late." As he saved the changes, a notification flashed across his terminal. The first reports of an unknown hostile force at the galaxy's edge, approaching systems that hadn't known war in 10,000 years. Professor Zix's Terrell looked at the alert, then at a gift Professor Miller had given him before leaving Earth, a simple chess piece, a knight. He finally understood the message she was trying to convey. Sometimes to protect peace one must understand war, and sometimes the species with the most violent history might be the one most dedicated to preventing violence's return. Perhaps humans were exactly what the galaxy needed after all.